Welcome to A Writer's Diary. I'm Cara Brookins, and this is Page 2. I've already done an outline and a basic voice sample for my latest novel, so now I'm ready to really start writing. Now this video diary, remember, is not intended to be a how-to video. It's simply a discussion of how one writer is writing one particular novel. The process of writing a novel can vary dramatically from one writer to another, and even with the same writer, from one novel to another. So if you're stuck, or maybe if you're writing your first novel, I hope that this video series will just give you a peek at what it's like to write a novel. Now, since I've already done the voice sample, and I really know the voice of my current novel, which is a psychological thriller based on real events in my own life, by the time I actually start writing the novel, I've been thinking about it for 2 or 3 weeks minimum. And I have the notes in the voice sample that I've written, but I've done very little technical research. This is still just a very creative, artistic process at this point. And that's when I love to begin writing, because there's a lot of creative energy that isn't sort of bogged down with all the technical details and things that you have to think about later on in the novel. And that energy really adds to all of the action at the beginning. And I think the reader really feels that energy if you can start writing when you still feel that. So I can usually get about 20 or 30 pages out of that, where I sit down and things are just flowing and I'm really excited about the novel. But at some point, and for me I always say it's at about 30 pages, I hit this wall where I start to have a lot more questions than answers as I'm writing. So that's when I have to stop. I have to pull myself back and say, don't just write anymore just to get a word count done. This is when I have to start getting more serious about the novel. And I have to research several basic things. You need to research the people, the time, the place, and then of course the technical details of the novel. Now for the people, hopefully at this point, just with your basic notes, you have a general idea of who is going to be in the novel. But once you start writing, you start to recognize that you may have some problems with names and things. So one of the things I do is I set up a character page for each major character in the novel. And again, this is not a very formal outline for me. I keep it really loose, but I want to write the things that I know about that person, about their physical characteristics, like their hair color and eye color and their height and maybe their weight, some general descriptions of what they look like to me. Occasionally, I'll even go and find a picture on the internet of someone who I think looks like this person, so that I have a really good visual image in mind. And I also want to really research the name of the characters. You have to really be careful that you don't do just the basic things like have several characters whose names start with the same letter, or whose names rhyme, or may sound silly when combined. One of the things that I do is say the names of the characters out loud, and say them out loud together in different combinations to see how the names first and last all sound collectively. And I also do some research on names. I like to use names that actually have meaning that works with the story, and check out the alliteration of the name. How does it really sound for that person? Make it match the person. It's a lot of fun to use family members' names or middle names and sneak in maybe the names of streets that you lived on or things like that. And it's fine to do that, but don't sacrifice the story just to slip in a name. You can always find another place to use that name if you're determined to use something personal. But make sure it works with whatever story you're writing it in. Also on my character page, not only do I have the physical characteristics and names listed, I try to do personality. And the way that I do that is to say, this is a person who, and then I give a very specific characteristic that gives you a feel for that person. For example, this is the type of a person who owns pet piranhas. Or this is a man who carries a mini dog in a purse carrier. Or this is the type of girl who hacks her neighbor's Wi-Fi. And just these strange characteristics will give you a really good feel for the type of personality that you're dealing with. Another thing that you can do if you're uncertain about a character is you can take an online personality test, something like the Myers-Briggs personality test, and take it as your character. So it will give you a really good feel for how would this character answer a particular question in these personality questions. And those types of tests really sort of lock you in because you have to think about who that character is. And it keeps the voice of the character solid throughout the novel if you do it at this really early stage. And remember not to just do this for the major characters. I really only have a sheet talking about each character for the major characters, but I'll sometimes have a couple of paragraphs for the minor characters, or just as I'm writing someone who's only going to show up once or twice, I make sure that I think of these things so that even the minor characters are earning their paycheck, so to speak. The second thing that I research is a time. Now, this is obvious if you're setting your novel in a different place and time, like a historical novel, or perhaps doing something futuristic, or if you're setting it like on a different planet or doing some world building where you're more aware of things that are associated with time. And this isn't just like a historical timeline, like who's the president and that sort of thing, but pay a lot of attention to the social rules that you use and keep them very consistent. And these would be things like how children relate to adults and how children relate to one another, how men and women relate to one another, the rules of dating and marriage. These are very different throughout time here on this earth, and you would want to establish the rules if you're doing some world building and creating your own location. You'd want to be very specific with what those social rules were in your novel. And especially pay attention with time to technology. If you're setting your novel in a specific time here on this earth, like let's say you're doing something in the 80s, then you can be very specific about what technology is available, and you may want that to make that a huge point in the novel. But if you're trying to just write a contemporary novel that has more of a timeless appeal, then be very careful with the way that you use technology. Because we've all seen movies where somebody picks up a brick of a cell phone or a phone with a cord that's attached to a wall, and it immediately dates the piece and, may make us giggle a little bit, and we're very aware of the technology time in that piece. So if you want it to be timeless, and if your novel isn't really technical in nature, then you want to be really gentle and sparse with the way that you use technology so that it has more of a timeless appeal. And again, this completely depends on the type of novel you're writing and whether or not it needs to be nailed down to a specific time in a real history. Just make it feel real and consistent. Now, the third thing that I research is place. And this depends a lot on whether or not you're setting your novel in a real place or a fictional town. I prefer to do a fictional town. There are so many details that you have to research for a real town. And even though these may seem like, oh, I know this town like the back of my hand, even small things that change, like a restaurant that's been there forever and then it goes out of business, people will constantly tell you, no, this isn't what was here or there. You'll hear constantly from readers about these little points. And again, it depends on the novel you're writing. Is it essential that it is located in a real place? If so, then just make very sure that you research it, and if at all possible, go there. And even if it's a fictional town, whatever state it's in, go there. There's a very different feel to different locations on the planet that I don't think can be described accurately in blogs and Google searches and such. You really have to go to a place to get a good feel of what it's like to be there. Little colloquialisms that the people will use, different terms and things that are common to an area of the country really give the novel a real flavor. If at all possible, go there. But even though we hear the old saying, write about what you know, if you really want to write about a place and you can't go there for whatever reason, you really can get a nice flavor on the internet. You can do a lot of research, but try to do some very personal research. Try to talk specifically to people in that area directly. with social media now, you can do Google Hangouts, you can do Skype, you can tweet people, Facebook. There are so many different ways that we have to talk directly to a person in an area of the country or the world that it's ridiculous for anyone to skip that step. Absolutely talk to people. And of course, I add all of this into my basic outline. Like I said, I do the people. When I'm researching people, I have a character sheet for the different people. But for time and place, these don't generally have as much research unless I'm building a full world, so that these all go into my basic outline. And the fourth thing I research are the technical details. Now, this, if you're doing like a medical thriller or something that's very police procedural, then you know very specifically what technical details you have to research. And sometimes, like I mentioned before, that computers and cell phones and those sorts of things would fit into the technical details as well. But don't forget the smaller things like music. It's really important to get the right music that you might put into a book, and those auditory things that you can throw in really give people a sense of time and place and set a mood and a tone for the book that's important. So don't leave out things like that, but make sure that they're accurate for the time and the place that you're setting the novel, as well as, maybe the race and the people who are listening to it, and the ages as well. So those are some of the technical details, and those are so specific per novel that it's difficult to cover everything. For these four things that I researched, the people, the time, the place, and the technical details, I'll give you some examples from my current novel that I've had to research. The people in this novel were really easy because they were all real people. It's a fictionalized novel, but it's based on the real events of my life. So it's myself and my kids, and that made the people really easy. But there's something really unique I did with one of the people. The antagonist in this book is actually a whole bunch of people combined into one. Well, by a whole bunch, I mean 3. But combining 3 humans into a single character took a lot of notes and a lot of sort of hammering out which pieces and parts would make a person and still make them feel real. So that was the unique characteristic of this novel that I had to do with people. Now, with time, we built a house, and that's what the novel is about, and we built it at a very specific time in history. I didn't lock the novel into that time. I wanted it to feel very, very contemporary, so I was very careful with how I used things like cell phones, and even though smartphones weren't big at the time, I made it seem as though they were, and I really kind of knocked the technology up to current times, even though it's rarely mentioned. So I was really gentle with the way that I used technology in the book. Place, of course, we built our house at a real place in a real town. I used all of the characteristics of the town that we built. It's in the same state, it's in the same location. I gave it a fictional name. Now, this was just a personal preference. I really could have used the town that we actually built the house in. This was a personal preference. I wanted to make up a place so I could have a bit of leeway in how I represented it. And technical details for me in this particular novel, I didn't have to research a lot. Again, it's because I actually built the house. So, I knew the technical details of what went into framing a house, building a foundation, and I knew some of the technical terms. Had this been a 100% fictional novel, then those were the types of things I would have been researching for this book. Now, at this point, when I'm researching all of these different parts, I'm still looking at these isolated elements rather than large overall scenes in the novel. I'm still pulling together a lot of data, even though I may have 30 pages down. I'm still pulling the big picture together. I'm setting up the real world. And if you've read anything about story arcs where you start kind of in a real world and then you launch into this inciting event that throws you into the story, into the real plot line, you know that that's what we're talking about here. When you're doing this research, you're setting up this person's real world and where they're going to go. Now, even though you're researching all of this stuff right here when you're 20 or 30 pages into the book, you're going to be really tempted to put it all in right here at the beginning. Don't do that. Resist that urge and save some of this information so that you can trickle it in throughout. You don't want this to read like Wikipedia, where you're researching a town and a time. Go ahead and learn it all at this point so that you can carefully filter it throughout the novel and sort of sprinkle it in like spices. If you put everything in right here at the beginning, you'll have a really slow novel and you'll lose the reader before they get 50 pages in. You want to be really careful about that. They don't need everything at the beginning. Give the reader a little bit of credit. That you want to kind of string them along. Give them credit that they'll intuitively know some of this and that they're willing to wait for you to tell them the rest so that you can sprinkle lots of action in right from the beginning. Don't make them wait for it. Just resist that urge. I know that it's something that I fight with, and so often when I go back and I edit my novels, it's this very beginning part that really sees the most hacking, because I've tried so hard to set up this world and to introduce myself to the characters. I'm still trying to figure out who they are, so I have way more information in there than the reader really needs. Lots of the research that you do is just for yourself. Maybe if you've told yourself, this is a girl who owns pet piranhas, the reader may never know that little detail, but they'll be able to sense that this is the type of girl who would own pet piranhas. So she's not going to go out and join an animal rights group or that sort of thing. But you may never release that detail that told you what type of person this was. And now after you get all this research underway, you've taken your notes about, the people, the time, the place, and the technical details. Now you're really going to have to start outlining the plot a little bit more, and this is where we really get into story. So that sounds like a topic for page 3. You can learn more about me on my website at www.carabrookins.com. Follow me on Twitter at cmbrookins. And of course, you can find my novels on Amazon.com. I look forward to seeing you in page 3.